get to where I can stand, and I'll move around a little bit too. So yeah, let me get kind of where I don't want to block the screen here. And I also want to get set up. I'm going to bring my drink, so pardon me, I'll have to take a drink every so often here as I talk here, because I've already been lecturing some today, and the allergies are killing me here around here lately, so you all know how that goes. Are we ready to go here? I'm going to start my timer here so that I don't go too long. Okay. All right, well, welcome and thank you all for coming. As Wayne said, my name is David Stewart. I'm a professor in the ECU History Department, but I'm not a historian. I'm actually a maritime archaeologist. And what that is we're closely related to history, of course, but what we're doing with archaeology is we're using artifacts to tell us about the people of the past. So maritime archaeologists are simply using artifacts to tell us about seafaring in the past. And that's where one of the areas where pirates come in. A little bit, I'm not from this area. I'm actually originally from Texas. My dad was in the Air Force. So when I was a kid, we moved around quite a lot, and I actually spent most of my childhood down in Charleston, South Carolina, in that region, stationed down there. And so when I got the job here at ECU, I was really happy because I like this landscape around here. I love the coastal areas of the Carolinas. So I was very happy to come back here. And I'm actually just about to complete my 20th year here at ECU. So it's been quite a while. It doesn't seem like that. We were just talking a few minutes ago about how fast the time goes by here. Along with that, let's just go ahead and get into talking here. So, as Wayne said, a lot of the work that I'm doing, actually, my background is in studying in the ancient Mediterranean. And so, I'm going to speak more about that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was trying to get closer to the audience, but let's do this here. This will work. Is this going to work? I'm not in the way, am I? Okay.
Oh, no.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's go right ahead here. So, yeah, I'm not really going to talk too much about Blackbeard here. I'm going to mention him, but that's actually, I'm not really involved with that project. So I'm going to spend more time talking about the things that I've done, but you'll see that when we study pirates, there's going to be a lot of connections between pirates over space and time. So hopefully this will be something that'll be interesting to you as well. And one of the issues with studying pirates is that everybody already knows what a pirate is, right? When you come into here, everybody has an idea in their heads of what pirates are, and a lot of that, of course, lately has been shaped by Johnny Depp and his movies, the Pirates of the Caribbean series. But that's only the latest thing. If you go back farther along, of course, you get Errol Flynn starring as Captain Blood. You get the Muppet Treasure Island and the live-action Treasure Island. And so pirates have gotten so much into popular culture that everybody already knows what a pirate looks like. You know, you've got your sword, your cutlass, you've got your eye patch and your hats and all these sorts of things. And of course, it's just like lots of other items that become so much into culture that everybody recognizes it, and you learn it when you're a little kid. You know, it's like if I showed you a photograph of the Golden Arches, everyone in here knows exactly what that is. Everybody knows that's the brand of McDonald's. You know that's where you go to get a hamburger. And you learn that as a very young age. When I drive down the road, I'm reminded of this because every time we see one on a road trip and my kids see it, they want to go to McDonald's, right? So, you learn these things at young ages. And kids learn from Scooby-Doo what a pirate looks like. And a lot of this are really stereotypical things. And they have a basis in fact, though. So when you go back to some of the earlier writings about pirates, you have in 1724 a book published called A General History of the Pirates, and it was published by Captain Charles Johnson. And historians go back and forth as to whether that's the real name of the person that wrote this, but either way, it doesn't really matter. The good thing about this is that it does give us some interesting information about pirates, but a lot of it is clearly embellished as well. But this book became so popular in the 18th century that the way that Johnson wrote and illustrated pirates actually has kind of come down. So when you look at these illustrations of Blackbeard, I guess this doesn't work on that doesn't work on the screen. Either way, I'll point it out. The Blackbeard illustrations, you see the one on the left there, that's from 1724, which is only 6 years after Blackbeard was captured and killed out here in North Carolina. So that's fairly close in time. And some of these things are going to be realistic. We know from historical accounts that Blackbeard did carry a lot of pistols into battle. Those were the old single-shot pistol. You can't reload it quickly. And so he's carrying a bunch of them already loaded so he can keep firing. He's got his cutlass in his hand in that illustration over there. He was known to put matches in his beard so that they would burn and cause smoke and so that he would scare everybody. I'm not sure how true that one is. But either way, this book really kind of set that stereotype of pirates. And so when you go all the way back or down in time to things like Scooby-Doo or Pirates of the Caribbean, we see the same types of stereotypes. And that's interesting from one perspective, but when we're trying to study pirates, we want to really try to get at what their lives were really like. What was it actually like to be a pirate? What did pirates actually do? How did they operate? That's the kind of things I'm really interested in. But yeah, this is just another one to illustrate this stereotypical of pirates. I'm teaching a class this semester called History of Piracy. And the very first day of class, I gave my class an assignment. They hate that, right? They hate it when you give them something the first day of class. But I asked them, okay, describe for me a typical pirate. And they all had to turn this in as a writing assignment. And then my assistant took that and turned it into a word cloud. So if you've seen these things, the way they work, the bigger the word is, that means the more responses. And so it's the kind of things you'd expect. Caribbean, Blackbeard, treasure, all these things are there. Major responses. Sea, revenge, cannons, skull, crossbones, parrots, all those sorts of things. This is the idea that students have of what pirates are. And the problem we have, if we're studying these as archaeologists and historians, is that studying pirates is a lot like studying any kind of group that doesn't leave a lot of writing behind. So, for example, there are archaeologists that I know that study slave life on plantations from the period of slavery, or archaeologists that study miners in the Old West, and I study sailors. And all of those groups have in common that they didn't typically write a lot of documents. And so it's very hard to find them through the study of history. And so this is where archaeology can come in, because what we're doing in archaeology is we're studying the things that people left behind. And we're also studying spatial relationships between things. And so one of the areas I've always been very interested in is the relationship between sites and how people think about the area that they live in, how they visualize their landscapes, things of that nature. And so the work that I've been doing really is looking at trying to understand pirate landscapes. And that's more what I'm going to spend time talking about here. Sorry, I'm getting my timer up here. So the work that I have done is largely in the Mediterranean, as Wayne said, and especially in the island of Crete here. And the subtitle of my talk was In Search of Pirates in the Birthplace of Western Civilization. Crete, if you're not familiar with the island, you're probably familiar with some of the mythology surrounding it. Crete was the legendary home of the Minotaur that was slain by Theseus in the Greek myth. And these myths, of course, are made-up stories in many ways, but a lot of them contain information about how the Greeks thought about their past, and they do contain factual data. And so if you go back to Crete, it's actually the earliest civilization in Europe. The civilization arose on there in between 2,000 and 3,000 BC, and they were contemporary with the ancient Egyptians, contemporary with the Hittite Empire and what is now Turkey, the Near Eastern city-states that figure so prominently in the Bible. Crete was a contemporary with all of those and was in contact with all of those. So it's what we call the first European civilization. And so for that reason, it's always fascinated me. I've been lucky enough to be working there since I was an undergraduate, starting in the early 1990s. And one of the things that we have here as well in Crete is we have a long association of piracy. When you get to the classical Greek period, this is the Greeks of the glories of Athens, the Greeks of the city-states, Athens and Sparta, all those. And the Greeks start writing their history down. One of their earliest historians was a guy named Thucydides, who lived in the 5th century BC. And as he said about Crete that it was the first place where a king, and he named this guy Minos. We don't actually know what the names of the people on Crete at that time. King Minos was the first one to build a navy and suppress piracy. And so there's this long-standing connection, more than 2,500 years, of Crete with piracy. The island was at some times, according to Thucydides, a place where they fought against pirates, but it also has a long history of the people on the island of Crete of being pirates. Of course, they're islanders, so they use the sea a lot for transport, for fishing, all these sorts of things. But they also had a reputation for being pirates. In fact, in the 1st century BC, Rome actually invades Crete and takes it over, ostensibly because the Cretans were doing too much piracy. So the Romans used that as an excuse, essentially, to add Crete to the Roman Empire, the late Roman Republic, the early Roman Empire. So there's this long-standing history in Crete of piracy going on, and that's what I've been really looking at. And I've been fascinated in the last few years by these two gentlemen that you see right here. They're both sea captains. And in fact, sometimes when I give this talk in other conferences, I've used the title, A Tale of Two Captains, and I have an article about that as well. Tale of Two Captains. Then the first one here, let's start with him. The guy on the right is Captain Thomas Abel Brimage Spratt, Royal Navy. He was from the British Royal Navy. And in the mid-1800s, he was sent by Britain to do a survey around the coast of Crete. He was charting the underwater, all of the underwater features in order to make accurate charts that could be used for navigation. Just like we do out here in the sounds and rivers of North Carolina and off the Carolina coast. If you want to navigate out there, you use charts to see where the water depths are and where the obstacles are and all those sorts of things. This is what Spratt was sent to Crete to do. And he came from a background in the Royal Navy. He'd already been in the Navy for about 20 years by this time. And he also came from a Royal Navy family, like a lot of sailors at that time. His dad was in the Royal Navy in the early 1800s and in fact was a hero at the Battle of Trafalgar, which was the great British naval victory over the French and the Spanish. It's the battle in which Nelson, the most famous British admiral of all, the battle in which Nelson was killed. Spratt's father had won distinction at that battle. So he comes from this long line of Royal Navy. And the guy he teamed up with while he was doing this work in Crete is the other one here. And notice, I like to use this because it contrasts very well. You've got Spratt in his very formal Royal Navy uniform, and then look at the guy on the left-hand side. This is a guy, we don't even know his name beyond his first name, which was Manias. It's a Greek name. There's still men named Manias in Greece today, although it's not a real common name. We don't know if he had a last name or if it wasn't preserved. And this guy was certainly illiterate. He came from the mountains of Crete, but he teamed up with Spratt and was a guide to Spratt in Spratt's travels around the island. But notice how Manias is dressed here. We'll come back to that in a minute. He's dressed a lot like what we saw with Blackbeard, and there's a reason for that. Let me just say a quick word here about Spratt. So Spratt has gone on. Spratt did his survey of the coast of Crete in the 1850s. He had to actually break off of that in the middle of the decade because he had to go to the Crimean War. He commanded a ship called HMS Spitfire right there in the Black Sea during the Crimean War, and won distinction doing that. And then he came back and finished the survey here. And he wrote, afterwards, he produced charts. These are really small versions, but you can actually blow them up. They're quite detailed. This is the same kind of thing. If you want to do navigation around North Carolina, you can order from the U.S. Government. You can order charts around here. You can buy them in stores in the coastal towns. That's the same kind of charts. In fact, the ones that Spratt created from his work on Crete actually still form the basis for the ones used by the British Admiralty today. You can still buy these Admiralty charts, and they're just updated versions of what Spratt did then. And the other main thing that he did was he wrote a book about his travels called Travels and Researches in Crete, published in 1865. And Spratt was a lot like most Royal Navy captains at the time. He was not just an officer, he was a gentleman. And a gentleman was expected at that time to be classically educated. So he had studied Greek history. And so when he's traveling around the island, in addition to doing the charting of the coast, he's also carrying his copy of Thucydides and Herodotus and Strabo and other Greek authors, and he's searching for antiquities. So there's a big controversy these days about all the antiquities that the British Museum has from places like Greece and whether they should return them. Some of those are because of people like Spratt. He bought antiquities from local Cretans. Of course, I'm sure he didn't pay a whole lot at that time. And then that gets its way back to Britain. So he writes this book that archaeologists in Crete still use today because it's very useful for understanding where ancient sites were, a lot about the culture, the geography. He was interested in all kinds of things. So he's very much a scientific and gentlemanly captain, exactly what you'd expect at that time. Now contrast that with this guy Manias. Manias comes from a plain in the mountains of West Crete. So Crete is totally unlike Eastern North Carolina. It's very mountainous. We were talking a while ago, you were telling me about going along the California coast, where you have the mountains right next to the sea. That's exactly like it is in most of Greece. And so Crete is a very mountainous island, not a lot of flat grounds. And so where Manias was from was this area called Sfakia in the White Mountains of West Crete. And what they were the frontier area. The Cretans themselves are very independent, even among Greeks today, and they consider themselves to be tough and strong. But within that, the toughest and the strongest are the mountain men of West Crete. That's where the tradition Manias came out of. It's the traditional place wherever the island gets invaded over its history, and it's been invaded many times because of where it is, that's where you run to get away from the invaders. So the most recent invasion in Crete was in 1941. The Germans invaded Crete during World War II and occupied it until the end of the war. But they never went very much up into the White Mountains because if you sent guys up there, they probably weren't coming back. So throughout their time, there was a strong resistance. Same thing was going on in Manias' time, just against a different and foreign invader. So when Manias is born in the late 1700s, we don't exactly when, he's coming into a Crete that is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is based in Turkey, the city of today Istanbul, but back then Constantinople. It's based there, and they took over much of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Crete, and they are, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I keep my timer here. It won't stay up. Yeah, so they had invaded and taken over Crete in the 1600s, and the Cretans very much resented them. A lot of this has to do with religion. The Ottomans were Muslims, and Crete is traditionally Christian. And so there was a Muslim-Christian conflict there. So the Cretans were constantly doing revolts, Greece in general. And so if you know the history of that part of the world, in the 1820s, the Greeks revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and they actually gained their freedom. But Crete stays under the control. They don't manage to win Crete free. It stays under the control of the Ottomans till 1898. So Manias is coming out of this background where his country is occupied by a hostile foreign power. And so what did he do? He participated in the rebellions, and his way of doing it was to outfit a ship and use it as a pirate vessel, attacking Turkish shipping, but especially raiding Turkish coastal villages. And taking people from them. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, what he's doing here. So that's why he's dressed like he is. If you look closely at him, you can see he's got in his sash, he's got a pistol, he's got a dagger, and of course he's holding a musket. So he looks like a pirate because he was a pirate. He was very much a pirate in the same way that Blackbeard was, just doing somewhat different things. Now you might think this is a strange friendship between him and Sprat, because Sprat's in a navy that now is trying to suppress things like piracy. In 1807, the Royal Navy started suppressing the slave trade, and they were always against piracy because Britain wanted to have free use of the seas. But it turns out that Manias was very useful to Sprat because, why? Because he knew every bit of the island. And this is where the idea of pirates really, we start to understand how they thought, is through people like Manias. Now, he didn't write it down, but he told all of this to Sprat, who then wrote it down, and it's come down to us through Sprat. And so Sprat was amazed to find out that no matter where you were in Crete, Manias knew people, and especially he knew the coastline. And so he knew every nook and cranny of the island, and he knew places far beyond. One of the things that the Royal Navy had a great difficulty dealing with was dealing with these people like Manias, these Greek pirates, because they were still a problem even in the 1850s when Sprat was there. And the Royal Navy, as good as it was the most powerful navy in the world at this time, it was still something that they couldn't handle these pirates very well. It's very similar to the situation that happened in Somalia about 10 or 15 years ago, where even powerful navies like the United States Navy initially had a great deal of difficulty in dealing with these small boats with guys coming out and armed with AK-47s attacking shipping. And it's because the same reason too, because these people know the local area way better than the naval forces do. So this is a quote from Sprat, speaking of Manias's ability to understand the coastline. Not only did he know everything about Crete, but this quote is really revealing. He also understood the islands of Casso, Carpatho, and Castellorizzo. Now, this is where I wish I had my pointer. I was counting on having being able to point these out with this, and I'm short, so it's going to be harder. But anyway, Cassos is this island right there. And why was that important? If you look at this from a maritime perspective, it becomes clear as what's going on here. What Manyas spent most of his time doing was raiding Turkish villages, because the Turks had established their people there. So you had this uneasy situation in Crete at the time, where some villages were predominantly Muslim Turks and some were predominantly Christian Greeks. And so Manyas was raiding the Turkish ones, most of which are over here in the eastern part of the island. And what do you do? It's not like piracy that we think of, going in and capturing a ship and taking their jewels and their money and all that. Mainly what you're doing in Mediterranean piracy at this time is you're capturing people. So you raid ashore, you usually come in at night, you kidnap as many people as you can, and then what do you do with them? You take them and sell them. If they're high status people who have money and connections, you might ransom them. And that's something that's gone on forever. Julius Caesar was captured by pirates 2,000 years ago and held for ransom. The Somalian pirates that I mentioned, that's their modus operandi, is to capture people and then hold the ship and the crew for ransom. That's exactly one thing that Manyas did with high status people, but most of the people he's capturing, he takes and sells them as slaves, because the slavery is still happening in the Mediterranean at this time. And Cassos there is one of the main slave markets. So that one makes sense. And then Carpathos is the next island right there, next to it, that big sort of long island. That one was another main Turkish-held island, and so what he's doing there is raiding. The one that's really intriguing is Castellorizzo, and it's going to be the one I can't reach because I'm too short almost. It's right up there. It's right off the coast of Turkey. So in other words, Manyas had the knowledge and skill to be able to raid all the way to this tiny island right off the enemy homeland. And this is about 200 nautical miles from Crete to get to there. And so it's telling us then, if you can interpret from this, that he's got a great deal of skill to be able to go right into the front door of the Ottoman Empire, right on their doorstep, steal their people away and sell them as slaves, because you have to evade the Turkish Navy, the Ottoman Coast Guard, and the Ottoman Navy to do this. So it takes a great deal of skill to be able to do it. And he also told us a lot about how you do this. Watching my time here. How you do this in terms of the actual tactics that pirates use. As you can see from the maps earlier, and you can see a little closer up view here, this is northeastern Crete. It's a coastline that's created by tectonic activity. Crete was created by mountains uplifting. And so there's lots of earthquakes there. I've been there several times when there were earthquakes. It's a constant thing. The coastline is heavily indented and very rocky. And so there's lots of dangerous places, but it also creates a lot of these little hidden bays like you see up here. Now that's not the kind of thing you want to bring your big merchant ship into. But what you can do is you can use that as a pirate to hide, and then you pounce on unsuspecting ships that come out. And so Manyas shows Spratt all these different places where they did that. And it helped Spratt to understand, and us through him, how pirates use a particular type of landscape. And this is probably the way that it was done back in classical Greek times. The one at the top right there, that's a 5th century BC Greek pot. Actually, it's a wine mixing bowl. And it has a merchant ship on the left. That's the bigger ship. And then on the right-hand side, you see a lower vessel that's being rowed. It has a sail up, but it's also being rowed. That's a galley. This is often interpreted as being a pirate galley coming out to chase a merchant ship. I don't think we know, because it doesn't say on the pot, and it could just be a warship chasing a ship. But either way, the point is the same. Merchant ships that are passing by a coast like this, what's dangerous is that these guys in these small, low, fast, maneuverable vessels can suddenly come out of a hidden cove and go after you. And that's probably been the way it is for time immemorial. Again, bringing it close to recent times, that's exactly what was happening off the coast of Somalia. Pirates would come out in these small, quite small vessels with outboard motors, and they'd go after these big container ships and tankers that were transiting Somalia. And it probably goes back much farther. This goes back to the Bronze Age, the time of the early Cretan civilizations. This one here, and you can see, again, this is a rowed vessel, and you've got guys there with shields and spears. They're having a battle on here. So what's really interesting to me about this is that what we're learning about these pirates from this is it's not just telling us about what happened at that time in the 1850s. the same types of tactics undoubtedly were used earlier times as well. And if you go back to a lot of the earlier literature, even back to things like the Greek, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're about to have a new Odyssey movie come out soon, starring Matt Damon and various others, so we'll see how that one goes. But at that time, there's a lot of little references in that to Greeks doing seafaring and doing raiding as well. The whole Trojan War was the Greeks launching an amphibious invasion across the Aegean. So I think a lot of this stuff, when you start to link up what we get information from a real pirate from the 19th century, a lot of those same things are happening in the past because the landscape's the same. There are still rowing vessels at that time. Sailing vessels, no matter what period, work the same way. The wind works on sails the same way now as it did 3,000 years ago. That hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed in recent times is the advent of motorized craft. The other thing with it, of course, that has really been useful to me and interesting is that it's helped me understand more about, as I mentioned, the way that pirates are using their landscape and understand it. I've already talked about them coming out of hidden coves to go after merchant ships. They also would do it sort of like in the Old West. You remember the old cowboy movies where you herd the cows or you herd the enemy into a box canyon where they can't get out? This is what the pirates would do as well. They'd come out in 2 or 3 of these fast rowing vessels and they'd chase a merchant ship, but they'd surround them in such a way as to make the merchant vessel either go into one of these box canyon coves that they couldn't get out of, or you'd run them across an area where you knew there was a reef, and then they'd get stuck on that, and then you'd be able to loot them at your leisure. That actually happened to some British craft in Spratt's time. He talks about that some as well. So from Manias, we get this whole picture of how the pirates actually operated, which is really much more than we could have gotten just through the scattered historical sources before, or even just looking at the archaeology. And what I'm doing now as an archaeologist is going back to Crete, and now I'm trying to revisit and find all these places, because oftentimes Spratt mentions a place, and sometimes he'll give the exact location. But a lot of these, he talks about these hidden coves, or Manias knew where this was, and he doesn't really tell exactly. So I'm going back now to this landscape and trying to locate a lot of these and then see what's in them. There's been some work done like this in Ireland. An Irish maritime archaeologist named Connie Kelleher has studied how that the Irish pirates would use the landscape, and not just pirates, but smugglers, because the two often go hand in hand. They would use these same types of hidden coves in Ireland. And if you go back and look at these things now, she's been able to find things like a hidden set of steps that are carved in the cliffs so that you can access the cove, places where they've carved out a little shelf to put a lantern on at night so that you can signal your people offshore, if it's time to come in and do smuggling, things like that. So what I'm doing now as part of my archaeology work is when I go back to Crete, I'm trying to track down all these places and understand them and see if there's any kind of markings like that still in the landscape. Hopefully going back here in July of this year. And I've got a graduate student who's working with me as well, who's doing some of this work. Let's see here. So I'm almost to the end. Yep, we've got about 2.5 minutes here. Perfect. The other part here is the aspect that I never thought of before, which is how you find water in this environment. The Mediterranean is dry and hot and arid, and especially this eastern part of Crete where Manias operated a lot. And so when you look at Spratt's charts, this is a close-up part, and you can't really see it, but just above the red circle, it says Aia Photia, which is the place name, and then you have it says good water. And you'll find this on lots of Spratt's charts, these little out-of-the-way places where you can find water. And he mentions in the text as well, getting some of this information from Manias. Manias told him where all the good watering places were. Now, why does a pirate need to know that? Well, they need to know it because if you're a pirate, you still have to resupply your ship, but you can't just sail into the regular port and get things because you're an outlaw. And so what do? Well, you have to be able to know where to find water in a landscape like this where you can get your ship in there, have a hidden enough place to refill your water casks. And so I'm trying to track down all these places like this as well. And how you do that, Spratt learned, and a couple times he says this more or less directly, he learned how to find these places because what the Cretan natives do is they look for certain plants, because certain plants, anybody who comes from ag background is going to know this, certain plants need water more than others or grow only around where there's good water. And so in Crete, you've got the myrtle, which grows where there's water. And the other big one, I took these ones myself. These were in West Crete. You can see the little river there. These are oleanders. They've got a nice bright green, but really what they're excellent for is they've got a nice bright flower on them as well. And so if you're transiting offshore, and you see the oleanders, you know that's a place that has permanent water. And so that's an indicator of where you can find these things. Again, some Spratt's coming out of England. He's coming from a completely different environment. He's not going to know all these things. And it's kind of helped me solve some mysteries. I've always wondered, I'll end this here. In West Crete, you have this very mountainous environment. This is actually the part of Crete that Manias is from. But in West Crete, you have little towns like Aeromelli here. And even today, you cannot get here by vehicle. You either have to walk down the mountain pass or you have to go by boat. That's how remote they are. And yet at Aeromelli, if you go a little bit to the east of it, where the other red dot up there is, about 2 miles, there's this church that dates back more than 1,000 years. It dates back to the first millennium AD. It's a Byzantine period church. This particular one is Aios Pavlos, St. Paul. And there's a long-standing tradition here that pirates used to use this church. And for many years, I used to wonder, I never really understood that. Last time I was there, I got a chance to go out and actually make that hike from Aeromelli. It's a brutal 2-mile hike in the sun when you're there in July. But what turns out here is that at Aios Pavlos here, I don't have the other slide. At Aios Pavlos, right behind where you see the church, where you see that cluster of vegetation, there's a spring. And there's been a natural spring there forever. That's why the church was built at that place, because they wanted to mark where the water was. And the other thing you have is you have a nice beach here. It's got some pebbles and gravel-sized things, but it's a lot of sand there too. It's the kind of beach you can bring small boats up on. So if you're a pirate, this is a location that's remote enough that you can come in and collect your water from a known source and get back away. And you're not too close to the town where you're going to have to worry about being attacked there while you're doing it. So it's kind of helping me to understand why they're doing this. So I'll just wrap it up. Yeah, this is the churchyard in Eastern Crete where Manias is buried. He actually ended up dying of a fever when they were in the city of Arapetra. Arapetra is actually the southernmost city in Europe, and he was buried there. At the time he was buried, the church was right at the edge of town. When I was there 2 years ago to find it, 2 or 3 years ago, 3 years ago, you actually have to search for it in the middle of town now. But it's still there. You can see a lot of this stuff is quite recent. So his grave cannot be found now. But this is where he was originally buried. So, it's this interesting case with these two gentlemen who come from very different backgrounds. And yet it's clear from Spratt's writings that even though this other guy was a pirate and uneducated by British standards, because he was a fellow seafarer and a very competent one, Spratt actually has a lot of respect for him. So anyway, all right, I will wrap it up there. Thanks a lot. Yeah, there's another view of the Church of St. Paul. I'll wrap it up there. Thank you to Wayne for inviting me and for buying me lunch as well. I'm glad I got to have the fried chicken. I'm even gladder that my wife is in Wyoming and can't catch me eating fried chicken. So I was able to sneak that one in while she's out of town. So yeah, as I put my email there, if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to help answer if I can. And I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Any questions or anything? I mean, David,
Yeah.
Is land piracy unique to the coast of North Carolina? Where the old Nags Head, the lantern on Jockey Ridge, that brought all the ships in and became, stuck on the sandbar?
No, yeah, it's not by any means unique. Actually, that's another common thing you have. His history of piracy course, one of the really interesting parts of it has been. Are we still? I don't want to get out of the film here. I always want to go closer to my audience, but anyway, that's okay. It's very common. In fact, you tend to see the same things popping up over places and times in piracy. And so you often get pirates in these kind of out-of-the-way places where people have especially been disadvantaged economically or left out of the world system. I mean, that's what happened in Somalia. Now, in Somalia, it became this thing where it got organized into crime syndicates and became a much more thing that you can't justify. But it sort of started out because other foreign fishing companies were coming in there and sort of taking whatever they wanted off the Somali coast. And so it sort of started out with a few guys going out to try to stop that. But that's typically what you get. You get pirates in these places where there are shipping lanes passing by someplace where people are usually generally impoverished. So the type of thing you're talking about there is actually, the term for that is wrecking, where you put up a false light and try to lure ships ashore. Yeah, they did that in Ireland, Scotland, parts of West England. The Pirates of Penzance, the west part of England is known. One of the one of the folks I know that works in the Caribbean, she did her dissertation about piracy or about Grand Cayman, and she did it on a wreck there that has a tradition of being a wreck or a series of wrecks that were done by people putting up these false lights. So no, that's actually a real common thing. It's everywhere, yeah. And I'm sure they did that on Crete too. I can't think of a specific reference to specifically wrecking, but when Mañas is talking about luring them into these places where you can make them run aground, that's the same thing he's talking about, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no worries. Please, David. Yeah.